You guys will find this really interesting. So you think, okay, what's the most hot rod factory thing you can find? I think that would be a 6.5 300 Weatherby with a 127 LRX, which has a lower G7 than what we're shooting out of the 22 Nosler. 228 at 34.75. Smoking. Obviously super flat. 23.3 inches of drift. 23.6. So our fast 22 Nosler hand load has identical drift to a 6.5 300 Weatherby out to 600 yards. Hit probability 88.7%. What were we at up here? 88.2. Basically the same. Hey guys, this is Tim with Little Crow Gunworks. Welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do a video on the 22 Nosler and kind of summarize what we learned and maybe expand a little bit on why we did it and why we picked the 22 Nosler. I'm sure some of you that are new to the channel because of the 7mm series, you may or may not have watched some of this 22 Nosler content, and you might be wondering to yourself, why a 22 Nosler? Why pick such an obscure, weird cartridge to do a whole series on? So, for those of you that have or haven't seen it, I'll circle back to what I talked about in the first video where we talked about why we did this. And the whole purpose of this was to create a training rifle, a long-range training rifle. Why a 22 Nosler? There's so many different options. Well, it really comes down to the numbers. And what I mean by that is we're talking about wind drift and hit probability. So those of you that are watching the 7mm series, we kind of set a limit for an ethical hunting range of 600 yards. Can you shoot farther than that? Sure, but if we say 600 is kind of our maximum, then we need something that, if you're going to have a training rifle, that replicates the flight characteristics of a big game hunting round, whatever that may be. So when you set that criteria of you want hit probability and drift to be the same, it starts to limit what you can use as a training rifle and get good information and good feedback. Because it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to do a ton of training with something that's ballistically inferior to your hunting rifle or ballistically superior to your hunting rifle, because you're going to get less valuable feedback. So, I know a lot of people use 223s as a trainer, and that can be fine under the right circumstances, but if you're using factory ammo, a 223 with a match bullet at the velocities it can produce is not a good clone for flight characteristics and hit probability of most or nearly any big game hunting ammo. So I created a big spreadsheet here that I'll show you guys. I'm going to turn on the screen recording here and go into some of the tools and show you how I found out this information and why we're looking at this the way we are and why we picked the 22 Nosler versus anything else. So I think I'll turn on the recording here. Well, I guess before I do, so those of you that watch the 22 Nosler series, whether you were on board from the beginning or you're a late viewer because of you're newly subscribed due to the 7mm series, you guys saw, like, I don't have to sugarcoat it. That thing frickin' hammers. I mean, the performance we're getting out of that cartridge and bullet combination are ridiculous. I didn't know what to expect going into it because I had never shot a 22 Nosler. I'd never owned one, never loaded for one. It was completely new to me. And I just applied my methods and my practices to it, and for reloading and all the things that I do and the tools that I use. And we were able to extract ridiculous performance out of that cartridge. I mean, going into it, if you would have told me that by the time I get some polished hand loads, I'd be able to shoot a 5-shot group at over 1,000 yards that was 6 inches. I'd have told you you're out of your mind. Now, I've shot 1,000 yards with a 223 before, but to do it with that much ease and to shoot, credit card size 5-shot groups at 640 yards and, anything inside of that, like shooting steel targets, it's almost boring. Like, it's automatic. And I haven't mentioned this, but I actually used that rifle in a little long range match that we put together. It was an invitational match that we did at the farm, just a handful of guys. I think there was 8 of us there, and all different skill levels, whatever. Well, I ended up winning that match with that 22 Nosler, and it's just the performance that we got out of it is just remarkable. Now, one of the targets in the match was an 8-inch square at 860 yards, and you had to take 4 shots at it. Well, I hit it on shots 1, 2, and 4. The third one kind of eked off the lower right corner, and the 3 that did hit the target occupied a little square on the corner of the 8-inch square. So like 3 of the shots would have landed on a credit card in the lower right corner of the 8-inch square. So I wasn't centered up perfectly, and I was a little bit upwind, but I would have easily put all 4 on a 5-inch square at 860, let alone an 8-inch square. It's just ridiculous performance. So long story short, it's certainly viable as a long-range training option. And part of the reason we did it is you can't buy one. So the 22 Nosler is it's an AR cartridge, and the only bolt action that I know of is made by Nosler, and it's like a entry-level synthetic stock short barrel, nothing special. I don't even recall what the twist rate is on it, but part of what makes this 22 Nosler work is the barrel length. So you do need, in my opinion, you need a 28-inch barrel, at least a 26, to really get the juice out of that cartridge that you need to replicate big game hunting cartridge flight characteristics, and we'll go into that. So I think I'll turn on our screen recording here. I made a big spreadsheet to compare these things, and those of you that have seen the 7mm series know how I find these hit probabilities, but I'll go into it briefly here. So let me get my recording fired up. All right, so I made this big spreadsheet that has all of our information on here, and it has the control conditions of what I was testing and what I used to find hit probability. And I used this AB Analytics program where you can enter whatever bullet you want to test. In this case, we'll say the Hornady 80 grain ELD. Let me get into H here. 80 grain ELDM. So you pick your bullet. You can add your velocity. At 28-inch barrel, we were around like 3130 with one of the powders and 3100 with the other. The finished product rifles are a 7 twist. Our test rifle was a 6.5 twist. I already have all the conditions in here. 10 mile an hour crosswind from 9 o'clock, 70 degrees, 29 inches of mercury, 60% humidity. So we hit calculate, and we got our little chart here. We have our elevation needed to hit the target, and then windage. And these numbers are what I transferred over to that spreadsheet. And then we go into our weapon employment zone, and what I had for variation was standard deviation of your ability to read wind was, let's say, 2 miles an hour, which means your extreme spread is about 6 miles an hour. So that would mean you can read the wind plus or minus 3 miles an hour. And then temperature for standard deviation, we had 5, which means you know the temperature within a 15-degree window. Pressure, standard deviation of 0.2 inches of mercury. Humidity I had high because people aren't that great at judging humidity, and it's the least important as far as how it affects your hit probability. So I had that standard deviation at 20, which means there's a 60% range of humidity that you could be guessing. Muzzle velocity standard deviation I had at 10 feet a second, which means your extreme spread would be about 30 feet a second. And then range estimation, I had that standard deviation at 3.33 meters, which means you're plus or minus, say, about 6 yards, 5 to 6 yards on your range. Inclination, angle, I left that standard deviation at the default that it comes up, which is 1 degree, meaning your extreme spread of the angle, your shot angle would be 3 degrees. Heading, latitude, same thing. That has to do with Coriolis, which is irrelevant unless you're shooting ELR. If you're shooting even 12, 13, 1400 yards, Coriolis is fun to talk about, but it doesn't matter. And then range to target, we had 600 yards. Rifle precision, we had 0.75 MOA, extreme spread. And we're looking at a 12-inch wide, 12-inch or 14-inch wide, 12-inch tall target. I think that's what I had on here. Yeah, 12-inch high, 14-inch wide. Okay. So you put all that in there, and then you simulate it, and it gives you a shot simulation. And what this is doing is it's running 1,000 possible scenarios, and then it plots them on this target. So you see all these little X's. Well, most of them are congregating in the center because depending on your variables, most of your hits are going to be kind of center mass. But these extremes that go off the side, that would be like, okay, well, you thought it was 10 miles an hour and it was really 7, or it was really 13. And the higher shots would be your faster shots, the lower shots would be your slower shots, and on and on. So this software allows you to run simulations and figure out what your hit probability would be. So that's where I got it for this chart. Now, I'm going to back out a little bit and just read some of the things on this chart. Okay, so our control was a 28-inch barrel, 22 Nosler with 80 grain ELDM at 3143 feet a second. And I think that was the peak velocity that I averaged when the barrel was 28 inches with N550. Our environment, as I went over, was 70 degrees, 29 inches of mercury, so we call that, Minnesota summer on a really nice day, or spring and fall on a really nice day. 60% humidity, 10 mile an hour crosswind. Target distance 600 yards. Target was 12 inches high by 14 inch wide rectangle. 0 was 100 yards for all cartridges. 2 mile an hour wind standard deviation, which means 6 mile an hour extreme spread, or plus or minus 3. 5 degree temperature SD, 2.2 inches of mercury, and on and on. And then we'll go into this here. So the hit probabilities listed in this chart assume that you can read wind to within a 6 mile an hour window, as I already said, plus or minus 3, and that you judge the wind direction exactly. This wind reading ability represents a long-range marksman with some level of skill. Novice wind reading ability is much worse than what's listed here. An expert would be a little bit better, which means novice hit probabilities would be much worse also, which is why a training rifle is so important. Being a competent wind reader is far and away the single most important factor in being able to hit targets once you know the range to the target. So obviously knowing the range is most important. Second is your ability to read wind. And then stuff that is Gucci to talk about, like low standard deviations or low extreme spread, tiny groups, blah, blah, stuff like that. High BC, I mean, that's all way less important than you think it is. It matters, yes, but knowing your range and knowing what the wind is doing vastly exceeds it as far as importance. And then over on the notes here, I have all rifles assume 0.75 MOA precision for 20 shots at 100 yards, which would be, let's say, a normal distribution. So I guess I won't go into that too much, but the way your shots disperse on target is a normal distribution, meaning that 68% of your shots would be just under half minute of angle. So most of them are going to be sub half. 95% would be under 0.62. 99.7% would be under 0.75. So that's assuming you can keep 20 shots under 3/4 MOA, which would be a tall order. So this is really these are really precise rifle conditions for all of these conditions. I put in here, in English, this represents very precise big game rifles. Now, we'll start going through the chart here. You can see I have a lot of text on here, and then I got a lot of muttering on the bottom. I don't know that we'll go into all that, but we'll go into the chart here. So I'll zoom into what we have so you can see a little better. And scoot this over. Try to zoom it so we get rid of most of that text on the side. Okay, so what we have here are, let's say, our different small caliber training options. Now, if you think, okay, well, why not a 223? Well, with a 223, if it's a factory gun or even a custom gun, if you're shooting factory ammo, the best option you're going to have as far as performance would be like 75 grain Hornady boat tail hollow point, and you would need a 9 twist to stabilize that, which not all 223s are, but you would need at least a 9 twist. And then because of the standard twist rates that a 223 comes in, they don't load any more aggressive high BC bullets than the 70 grain Hornady boat tail hollow point. So like that's the most aerodynamic bullet you can find in a 223 factory ammo. The G7 BC on that is .179. Muzzle velocity for their Superformance ammo is 2930. Their match ammo is like 2780. So even the hot rod stuff, at 600 yards, our drop is 88.6 inches. Drift at 600 is 40.9. Hit probability on that 12 by 14 box, given the conditions I already went over, 62.6%. So you go, okay, well, that doesn't sound too terrible. Well, when you start comparing it to a lot of big game hunting cartridges, like, for example, I made a deer, antelope, black bear, coyote category. We have your typical 243, 6 Creed, 6XC, stuff like that, your fast 6 millimeters. Running a 103 ELDX, like 6 Creed factory 103 ammo, is the G7 is 262 and the velocity is 2960. So these are pretty much all of these examples I have on here are factory ammo. You know, you can hand load stuff and turn it up a little bit and use different bullets and whatever, but I wanted to include the most amount of people in this because not everybody hand loads, so I wanted it to be relevant for as many people as I could make it. So your 6 Creed, 262 G7, 2960 velocity, drift or drop 71.1, drift 25.7, hit probability 85.3. So you see how this chart works. Well, the drop we don't care so much about because that hinges heavily on muzzle velocity and how fast it's getting down the road before it slows down. And drop, if you're shooting long range, that's really easy to correct for with our elevation turret and ballistic solvers and drop charts and stuff like that. You can figure that out ahead of time and have a drop chart, and it's going to be reliable. What you can't figure out ahead of time necessarily is the wind. You don't know what conditions you're going to have when you're out shooting or out hunting. So we want what you're practicing with, we want the drift to be the same and the hit probability to be the same. So if you're out with a training rifle and you're making calls and making adjustments and making shots and you're hitting targets, or you're a little bit downwind, a little bit upwind, you're just off the edge or whatever you're learning, that feedback that you're getting with each shot is good feedback, because if the training rifle performance matches your big game rifle performance or is very similar, that feedback you're getting is valuable. Where you can know, like, all right, however you're doing with your training rifle, that's how you're going to do in the field when that deer or elk or whatever is standing there. Where you're not practicing with an inferior system or something that has lower ballistic capability, and you're all over the place and you're not making a lot of hits, and it's really easy to get discouraged and get negative feedback when you're using a system that's not as well equipped as your hunting rifle. And that relationship works both ways, where if you have a training rifle that the performance is way higher than your big game hunting rifle, the same thing happens, where you start to get overconfident and you overestimate your abilities because you're making a lot of hits. Well, you might be running some hot rod training rifle or some hot rod cartridge that vastly exceeds the performance of your big game run rifle. So you need something that's kind of in the sweet spot. And as you can see with all these different cartridges, we have the fast 6mm, 25-06 with a 110 ELDX, 6.5 class, say a Creed or a Swede or 260 Remington, running a 143 ELDX. So these are the bullets that we also consider adequate for medium-sized game. The LDXs are fine for that, for deer and antelope and medium-sized game. So you see all these different bullets. These are high-performance, high BC bullets. And as you can see here, and the factory velocities that they come out at, you see the drop. There's quite a bit of disparity there because I said, muzzle velocity dictates drop. If we look at the 25-06, it's coming out at 3140. Well, that's the fastest in this category, and out to 600 yards, it has the least drop. Surprise, surprise. I mean, it's obvious. But when you talk about drift, now the BC starts to matter a little bit more. So we see it has the most drift in the category, despite the fact that it's coming out the barrel the fastest, because the BC is the lowest. So it's easy to get lost in these numbers, but what's important is how much it's drifting to a certain degree, but the hit probability is even more important, because that's what's going to give you that positive feedback on if your wind rating is adequate or if it needs to be improved or what. So you see these numbers, they're in the 80-something% range. Let's say, what do we have here? 83 to 91. The 280 Ackley with 162 factory ELDX is at 2850 because that BC is so high and the velocity is decent. Our drift is only 22 inches, hit probability 91. So you see we're 83 to about 91.5. Well, if you go back up to our 223 here, this is the best you're going to get out of a 223. You're only at 62.6. So any other bullet you use in a 223 for factory ammo is going to be worse, considerably worse. So now if you want to use a 223, you have to hand load this 80 grain ELD, and you got to use a really long barrel so you can get up to the velocities that we're generating with the 22 Nosler. Now we go into our heavy game cartridges, elk, caribou, sheep, moose, etc. We have our bigger long action cartridges and bonded or monolithic bullet choices, which is what we promote. That you need something a little more heavily constructed when you're talking these bigger game, because you want deep penetration and hopefully an exit if you can get it. So you see we have a wide variety of G7 ballistic coefficients here. I did put, you see I highlighted kind of in this peach color, your legacy, like dumpy type low BC bullets that are old school. So you can see by comparison, and I use the same cartridge as well. So we have two 270 lines, two 280 lines, two 7 Rem Mag lines. So you can see how using a dumpy bullet affects your hit probability and drift and so on compared to a higher BC option. So you see our drifts for the dumpy legacy bullets are all over 30 inches, and the higher BC options are all around that 21, 22. Hit probabilities, same thing. You're in the upper 70s for the legacy bullets, and with the high BC bullets, 92, 90, 89. Well, you see these, because these are quote-unquote magnums or higher performance long action cartridges, your hit probabilities are on the higher 80 side, low 90 side. Well, how do you replicate that in a training rifle? You use a 22 Nosler and a high BC bullet. So for the factory option, which is, I would say, the lowest performance of what we did last summer with that 22 Nosler, we have our 85 grain RDF factory ammo, really good G7 254. Muzzle velocity was about 2,900 feet a second with a 28-inch barrel. Kind of no matter when I went out, it was around that 2,900 number, which under these conditions that I mentioned before would be 69 inches of drop, which we don't really care about, 27.5 inches of drift, 83%. So while the performance is very similar to the short action cartridges, it's a little bit lower, but it's in the neighborhood. And then the bigger long action cartridges, it's a handful of percent below, but you're in the neighborhood is the point. Like, your drift is very similar within a few inches, your hit probability is similar within a handful of percent. It's a great training option if you don't hand load. It's really the only training option if you want to replicate big game performance, because I'm sure some people watch this and they thought, well, why not a Valkyrie? Why not this? Why not that? Well, the factory ammo is inferior to this 85 grain RDF factory ammo in terms of performance, in terms of drift and hit probability. The Valkyrie has 3 grains less capacity than the 22 Nosler, so if you want the same performance, even if you hand load it, you're going to have to stand on it more and lean on it and run it up to higher pressures to get the same velocity. Same with, so now like Hornady came out with the 22 Arc, same thing. That's a different shaped Valkyrie, basically. It has, I think, 3 or 4 grains less capacity than the 22 Nosler. So you could probably get similar velocities for the same barrel length as this 22 Nosler, but you'd have to lean on it harder. And you're not going to get any brass but Hornady for a while, and Hornady brass doesn't take well to being leaned on. You're not going to get many firings out of it, and it's going to go in the trash. So even with that, even with the 22 Arc out now, they're going to have good factory ammo options for a training rifle, but the performance is still going to be below the 22 Nosler by a little. I think they're loading the 88 grain ELD, which has a slightly higher BC than this 85 grain RDF, but I think the velocity is going to be lower. And primarily, they're just going to be in gas guns. So if you wanted to use the 22 Arc, you'd have to have a bolt gun built anyway, which I think it will probably end up offering that cartridge in time with this training option, where your 2 options will be 22 Arc or 22 Nosler. It's just, we got to this project before the 22 Arc was a thing. So at the time, the 22 Nosler was the best option. So you look at this performance, we have 27.5 inches of drift, 82.6 hit probability. Well, when you look at what we were able to do with the hand loads, as you saw in the series, we gave up on the 75 grain ELD early on, not because it's a bad option, it's a great option. 238 G7, we were able to get it up to really high velocity. As you can see, the drop is better than anything else we did. Drift is right in the middle. Hit probability is great. But with the powders I was using and the jump that I started at, the gun just didn't like it. So Dale shoots the 75 and his 223 Ackley for prairie dogs, and so do a lot of our friends. That's what they use as a 75. It's a dynamite option. We just went with the 80 because the BC is a little better, and the gun seemed to like them right off the bat. So, and then in our series, if you watched it, you saw that we stopped short on cropping the barrel. We had talked about cropping it down to 22. Well, by the time we got down to 25-inch barrel, our velocity had suffered enough that you see our hit probability here at 83.9%. We were going to start falling below even the factory ammo with a 28-inch barrel, so we didn't want to do that. So we stopped a little bit short, but you can see, like with our 80 grain ELDM, and I put slow 26, meaning we built 2 finished product rifles. One is a 26-inch barrel, one is a 28, and we have another 26 and another 28-inch barrel in the weightings for if somebody wants to order some combination of something. But slow 26 means with the 26-inch finished product rifle and our slower of our 4 hand loads, as we remember, we had 2 fast and 2 slow. The 2 slower ones would be in that 29-30, or I should say they were in that 29-30 neighborhood for velocity, where the 28-inch finished product rifle with our faster hand loads were in that 31-40, 31-30 range. So I'm kind of trying, you see, I'm like trying to bookend what we were able to get with the hand loads, where taking the slow end and the high end so you can see how that affects drift and hit probability. So our slow option, 26.4 inches of drift, 84% hit probability. And adding a couple hundred feet a second, you lose about 3 inches of drift and you gain a little over 4% hit probability. So it's not a big difference. What the velocity does buy you is forgiveness on ranging error, because the trajectory is flatter. As you can see, only 62.7 inches of drop versus 74. So that's where velocity matters, is if your range is wrong, the bullet's coming in at a shallower angle, so you're more likely to hit the target if you have a ranging error. That's where velocity helps you, is it's flatter. So if you have ranging error, you're more likely to hit it with something faster. But if you know the range, that drop in that flatness doesn't account for a whole lot when you talk about hit probability. It does help it a little because it's spending less time in the air, so there's less time for it to get pushed around and that sort of thing. But you can see that whether you go with the slow option or the fast option, 84%, 88%, now you're really competitive with these short action hunting cartridges and high BC bullet combinations. And I didn't mention this, but if you're using any of these cartridges with a bullet that doesn't have high BC like this, these hit probabilities are going to plummet. So for those of you that are shooting long range and you realize you want a high BC option and that it's important, you're going to be picking one of these, higher stepping, higher BC bullet options, and you're in that 80% range, which is right where we landed with the 22 Nosler. And the drifts are very similar. You see we're in the 21.6 to 27.1, and these are 23 to 26. So that's about as close as you can get. For any, even the factory ammo is right in there. So, and then we look at the heavy game cartridges, same thing. We're in the mid to upper 80, 90% category, which would be right where the fast 28-inch hand loads were. 88.2. I mean, you're splitting hairs at that point, whether it's 88.2 or 90.3 or 89 points. It's all the same, basically. So that's why we picked the 22 Nosler. And I, for giggles down here, I did put. So I guess let's finish going through the big game stuff. So we had 7 rem mag, and then get down to 300 Win Mag, 300 Weatherby, using 180 grain bullets, 200 grain bullets, and you think, well, a 22 Nosler can't hang with a big 300 Magnum. Well, look at these, 85.2, 85.9, right in there. Whether it's the slow hand load or the fast hand load, you're right in there. Same thing with a 300 PRC with a 190 CX, which is the bullet we would recommend for this heavy game out of a 300 PRC. That factory ammo is coming out at 3,000 feet a second. G7's 294 on that bullet. 23 inches of drift, 91% hit probability. Right in there with what we got out of the 22 Nosler. 338 Win Mag, and I know not a lot of people would be shooting this just because of the recoil, but I wanted to put it on here just so you can see how relevant this is. 230 ELDX, 309 G7, 2810 muzzle velocity. Drops are similar, 24.1 inches of drift, 89% hit probability. So the drift is actually very similar. 23.6, 26.4, yeah, 24.1, 25.4, and the hit probabilities are right in there. And then for giggles, I put hot rod cartridges / unicorns, which have terrible barrel life. You guys will find this really interesting. So you think, okay, what's the most hot rod factory thing you can find? I think that would be a 6.5 300 Weatherby with a 127 LRX, which has a lower G7 than what we're shooting out of the 22 Nosler. 228 at 34.75. Whew. Smoking. Obviously super flat. 23.3 inches of drift. 23.6. So our fast 22 Nosler hand load has identical drift to a 6.5 300 Weatherby out to 600 yards. Hit probability 88.7%. What were we at up here? 88.2. Basically the same. So you can use our 28-inch 22 Nosler and our higher step and hand loads to mimic a 6.5 300 Weatherby out to 600 yards. You see how applicable this is once you start putting numbers to it, where you just look at drop charts and velocities and whatever, you would never come to this conclusion. But when you actually use a program that can simulate this sort of stuff, you see the truth come out. And then I put some, for funsies, I put some stuff down here, like these are just crazy. So this 257 Weatherby, this is a gun that I have. I'm shooting the 131 Blackjack Ace. I still have some of those left. 340 G7. I got it at 33 and a quarter right now. I think I have a 28-inch barrel. And these numbers are preposterous. 48.6 inches of drop and only 15.9 inches of drift. 97.7% hit probability. Thing's just a laser. With that combination, one time I was out shooting with Dale in December a couple years ago, and with that rifle I was able to make a cold bore shot on a 5-inch circle at 592 yards. Cold bore, first shot, bingo. It's just a laser. And Dale built the gun, but he had never seen me shoot it, so I lay down to take the shot, and he's spotting for me, watching through his spotter, and I touch that thing off, and it's 590 yards. It's there, like, instantly. And I just hear him, he just starts laughing. He couldn't even say anything, because he's spent years watching trace through a spotter, and he watches this thing, and it's just like a rope, like it's on a rail, and he just starts laughing. He's like, wow, that's ridiculous. So that one, and obviously that's a hand load. You know, that's not a fact. None of these are, except for the 6.5 300 Weatherby. Another option, 22 Creedmoor. That's just a laser. I see I got a spelling error here. But that one, I don't think there might be factory ammo now. I don't know a ton about the 22 Creedmoor and what they're putting out for it. I know they were talking about putting out factory ammo. Maybe you guys can let me know down in the comments if you know anything about that. But we have some experience hand loading with it. Dale has built rifles in 22 Creed before, but if you're using something like that, you can see that, like, you're using our same 80 grain ELDM, except you're getting another 400 feet a second of velocity out of it compared to the 22 Nosler. And drop is next to nothing. 45 inches, and does drift a little more than my Weatherby, 19.3 inches, 95% hit probability. So while that thing's a laser, there probably isn't a better bolt action Coyote cartridge. It's not that applicable to training for your big game hunting rifle. It exceeds the performance of your big game hunting combination for drift and hit probability, and it can have a tendency to make you overconfident, because you're smacking targets easily without really getting pushed around, and especially out to 600 yards. If you shot farther than that, you'd start to get pushed around a little bit, but out to reasonable ranges, not that great of a training tool, because it'd be too easy. And then this bottom one is my L cartridge that I have. It's a 7300 Norma improved, and I'm running a 160 CX at 35-30. So I'm putting probably 200 feet a second on a 28 Nosler, and I actually had it higher than that. I think it topped out at like 3670, but it wasn't happy up there. It wouldn't shoot until I brought it down to 35-30. It's just too erratic. But where it is now, 44 inches of drop, 16 inches of drift, 97.3% hit probability. So they weren't relevant for this, but I just wanted to show you guys, like, even if you get up into these crazy performance unicorns or the barrel life is absolutely awful, how much that hit probability actually goes up. It's not as much as you think. It's 5 to 7% for some of these, and the 6.5 300 Weatherby with the 127 LRX, is right in the neighborhood of a lot of these other big game hunting options. It's flatter, obviously, because of the velocity, but the drift and the hit probability are right in there with a lot of these other things, and right in there with our 22 Nosler training rifle. So that was probably a little more long-winded than you guys needed, but I just wanted to review this because I felt like the way I ended the last video and put a bow on the testing, I didn't really explain the ins and outs of why we did this. And I wanted to come full circle and put a bow on it and show you, like, there's a lot of options out there for training rifles, but there aren't many options that will mimic the majority of big game hunting options. And I think that's very important in the experience I have and the amount of rounds I've fired at long range, like my 257 Weatherby. I expect to hit everything I shoot at. There's never a time where I break the trigger on that thing that I think I'm going to miss. That thing, I've shot like cell phone size groups at over 1,000 yards. Super small. Like, that thing is just an absolute laser. But you don't learn much. You know, when you have that kind of performance, you're not learning anything. When you miss, it's an anomaly. Not when you hit, it's an anomaly. When you miss, it's an anomaly. So it's not great for practice. It's great for hitting stuff, but not great if you really want to learn a lot. And that's where, like, I see the value. I see some people say online and in the comments, well, you should get a 223 or a 308 training rifle to learn how to shoot long range. Now, while I agree with that, I don't think it should be your first choice because the performance is not great, especially with a 308. Like, I use a 308 for training, but I have a ton of experience. And I'm at the point now where I'm trying to challenge myself. Like, I want to go out with a 308 and shoot at smaller targets and see if I can go the whole day without missing. Because it's not forgiving at all. You get pushed all over the place and there's zero room for error. So I'm at that point where I'm trying to, like, step down in performance to try to keep the first 1,000 yards interesting. Where if you're just starting out, that's probably not the best choice. Now, some of you, depending on how determined you are, you may stick with it and force yourself to learn under those conditions, but it can be easy to get discouraged, especially if you don't have a mentor or somebody that can help you along with this. I didn't have a mentor. I had to learn all this stuff on my own, and I was never in the military. I didn't go to school for this stuff. Like, I had to teach myself. My dad wasn't into it. I mean, he hunted, but I had to learn how to do this on my own. So I started out with a really high performance cartridge. Like, I really started my long range shooting with a 338 Lapua Magnum, shooting a 300 grain Burger. I mean, the pinnacle of long range performance as far as not getting pushed around by the wind. I mean, that made it really easy to hit stuff. But I didn't learn a lot, so then I started stepping down in performance just to make it interesting. And I think that's a better route to go. I think this is a long-winded way of saying, like, I think starting with something a little higher performance, where, like our 22 Nosler, where it actually mimics your hunting rifle, and the performance is good enough that you can start to build some confidence, but you're not going to get overconfident because the performance doesn't exceed your hunting rifle. So whatever level of confidence you build and whatever amount of learning you do, it's applicable to your hunting. Where an inferior performance cartridge, you're getting a false reading on what you need to be working on. And a hot stepping cartridge, same thing. You're not learning anything. So that's I guess that's the long and the short of it. I don't know how long this video was, but I feel like I adequately explained it. And next I'm going to be getting up the finished product rifle videos so you can see what we ended up doing with these and what we ended up using. They're shooting great, obviously, because I was able to polish 4 different hand loads and run those through those new finished product rifles and figure out which ones they like, and they're shooting amazingly well. So that's why the 22 Nosler, I guess. We looked at all our options, and there wasn't anything else that we could do in a small bore like this that could replicate the performance we wanted. You could go up in cartridge, like you could go up to a 6mm or a 6.5 or something like that and do the same thing, but you're adding recoil, which can be a distraction. And then also you start losing the secondary applications that this 22 Nosler has, where it's a dynamite coyote option and a dynamite prairie dog varmint option. So if you're going to be shooting higher volume, where the barrel life on these things is probably 3,000 to 4,000 rounds, where, like a 6 Creedmoor, you're not going to get that many rounds out of that. 6.5 Creed, you probably would. But then you up to 6.5, you start losing the varmint application. So we figured this was the best sweet spot, and that's why we went with it, just because it did everything we needed and nothing we didn't. Now, we wish there was maybe a little better brass option, but other than that, it did everything we wanted it to, and the performance actually exceeded my expectations going into the project. So if you guys have any questions about getting a 22 Nosler, you can feel free to call us. I'm only in the office a couple days a week, but the guys will get you in touch with me, and we can, if you want something different than what we came up with, obviously we can build you whatever you want, but we just picked something to start with, and we can I'll go into the components and why we chose what we chose in the showcase videos on the finished product rifles. But that's all I have for now. I guess I hope that wasn't too much information. I know I ran through this maybe a little bit quickly, but if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share with your friends, all that good stuff, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.